Hello and welcome to All You Can Board. I'm Carlo, and today I'm going to be reviewing a pair of games here that are under the same kind of game system, and that is, of course, Imperium Classics and Imperium Legends. So these are co-designed by Nigel Buckle and David Turtze with artwork from the Miko, and they are published by Osprey Games. So these games play 1 to 4 players, and they are basically deck-building, civilization-themed games. These are both standalone boxes, so you can buy either one on its own, or you can buy them both and then kind of mix and match them together to use some of the nation decks from one and the other, as well as some of the common cards. So again, they work just fine as standalone products, but you can also buy them and kind of mix them together in a fairly easy way. So I'm going to cover that a little bit more later, but I just want to say a couple notes before I get into the overview and how this actually plays, is that this is a very ambitious game. This is something that was clearly worked on for years, and there aren't many games that have this level of ambition and this level of scope to them in terms of how much care and sort of time has clearly gone into this. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to do a standalone review for this game, and also just because I have a lot of sort of conflicting thoughts, both positive and negative, about this game. There's just a lot to talk about, and I do want to just preface this by saying that I've only played this game solo so far, so this is pretty much a review of the solo game, although I will be touching on player count and just kind of what the added player count or expanded player count does to the game as well, even though I don't have direct experience with it myself. So the final thing before going over the overview here is just that this doesn't take into account that there's going to be Imperium Horizons, which is the third one in the series, coming out later this year. So there are 8 nations in each of these boxes already. Horizons, I believe, is going to have 14, so you'll have a total of 30. It's going to have some updated rules and some updated errata to replace some of the cards that have been updated from these sets. So I'm not, this review is coming out before Imperium Horizons is out, so if you're seeing this later in the future, once Horizons is out, my thoughts on the entire system as a whole might be slightly different once I potentially try that. But otherwise, you can use the timestamps below to get through different sections. If you already know kind of how the game is played and you just want to see how I break down the actual review, feel free to use the timestamps. Otherwise, let's talk about how you actually play the game. So basically, each player starts by choosing a faction deck, which is a civilization or a nation. Your opponents are going to pick one as well, or if you're playing solo, you're going to assign one to your solo opponent. Most of these are real-world nations, such as the Greeks, Vikings, Egyptians, etc., and some of which are fictitious, such as the Utopians or the Atlanteans. There are 8 nations in each box, as I mentioned, with the ones in the Legends box are generally more high complexity than the ones in the Classics box, and the rulebooks each have a complexity rating ranging from 1 to 5 for each of the nations, so you know kind of how complex they are. Most nations will start in a barbarian state, as shown on this card here, and throughout the game will be advancing towards becoming an empire. Some cards can only be played while your nation is in a barbarian state, some only while in an empire state, and others can be played in either case. This applies both to cards in the starting decks for each nation, as well as the common cards that can be acquired by both players throughout. Your nation deck in this game tends to be a lot more intricate than most decks in most deck building games of the sort. It's going to have to be split up based on certain icons on them as part of the setup. So not only will you have your main starting deck, but you'll also have a nation deck made up of cards that you'll be adding to your main deck throughout the game. Whenever you deplete your deck and you need to reshuffle, you first take the top card of your nation deck and you add it in before shuffling up that new deck. So as you're playing, your civilization is progressing both thematically and mechanically, because you're going to have access to new cards, and your deck composition will just change throughout. Depending which nation you're playing, you're going to have a different number of cards in this nation deck, so you're going to have to run through it a different number of times depending on who you're playing in order to actually become an empire. But basically, once you take that last card from your nation deck and you've depleted your deck and you put that in and shuffle it and you reveal your what's called your accession card, which is kind of your starting card for your faction, you are now going to flip over your barbarian state card into the empire side. And what that means is now you are an empire, and you're going to be able to, going forward through the rest of the game, anytime you deplete your deck, you're going to be able to add these development cards now to your deck. But instead of adding them face down like you did with the nations, you look through them and you have to pick out which one you want, but they have cost to actually build these cards. So these often provide very strong abilities or ways to get a lot of points. You can also buy fame cards later through the game, which is a common stack of these high victory point cards that all players have access to from the sort of market row up here. Some cards have a flat point value, others have a question mark or an asterisk because their values are based on the cards in your deck. Then you also have pinned cards, which are cards that have this little infinity symbol. Most cards in the game that you play will go straight to your discard pile and are one-time use. However, if you play a pinned card, it stays on your board face up and has an ongoing effect for the rest of the game. So there are all kinds of different types of cards. I mentioned the fame cards, I mentioned your nation cards, your accession cards. Then even on the board from the common cards that we get from the market, you've got regions and uncivilized cards and civilized cards, and I can't even remember what these blue ones are called right now, tributary cards. You've got, the locations. I won't get into all those because they have their own little intricacies, but one that I do really want to cover is the unrest cards. So most nations start with at least one or two of these in their deck, but players can also gain or shed them throughout the game. They're bad cards because they're just -2 points at the end of the game, and they have no actual ability aside from offering you ways to remove them from your deck by spending resources. There's still a few other intricacies about the game, but the last thing I really want to focus on here and tell you about is, especially because this really stands out in terms of the deck building genre, is the history aspect of the game. So what happens here, normally in a deck building game, when you trash a card, remove a card from your deck, it just gets removed and you never see it again, and once the game is done, you kind of just put it back in the box and it gets put back for next time. In this game, you have a way of putting a card in your history, which is not only is it interesting and thematically it makes sense, but from a mechanical standpoint, it sort of unclutters things a little bit. If you put something in your history, you're basically putting it in a pile where it's removed from your deck. You're not going to see it anymore throughout the game, but at the end of the game, when you go to count points, everything that's in your history, you count the point values on those, but also let's say you have like 3 blue cards, 3 tributaries in there, and you had some other card that says you score for every tributary card you have in your deck. Well, your history counts as part of your deck. It just wasn't your main deck that you're drawing from. So putting cards in your history is a way to still get that, whether it's a point value or some type of condition met for some other card, to still have it, but not having it cluttering up where you're drawing it and perhaps not wanting to play it anymore throughout the game. Or sometimes it's a card that just gives you points and doesn't have an effect. So maybe you want to get it into your history right away so that you have the points on lockdown, but you don't have to draw this card that's not going to do anything for you throughout the game. So now that I've covered a lot of the aspects of the game itself, I'll just quickly tell you the flow of the game is basically on your turn, you're choosing one of 3 options, which is either to activate, innovate, or revolt. Activate is where probably 80 to 90% of your turns at least are going to be, or at least with most nations it's going to depend, but activate is where you actually get to play cards from your hand, activate stuff that's on the board, buy cards from the market row, just as long as you have cards that can do it. Basically, this is kind of the biggest phase. You get 3 actions by default. There's some ways you can get other actions, but that's pretty much it. The second option is to innovate, which means you just immediately discard your whole hand, but then you get to take any card from this market row in front of you and add it to your deck. And you do what's called breaking through, which means that if there's an unrest card attached to that card, you don't have to take the unrest card with it. You just take the good card. Whereas normally if you weren't breaking through and you were just gaining the card, you would have to take the bad unrest card with it. And the third option you can take on your turn is called revolt, which is just that it allows you to remove all the unrest cards from your hand and basically remove them from your deck and put them back into this common pile. So let's say your hand of 5 cards, you had 3 or 4 unrest. It might not feel like you're getting much done on your turn, but to clean out that many useless cards can make a big difference. So that is it basically for the overview of the game. Basically at the end of the game, you're just going to, once, there's various different end conditions, whether it's you've run through a certain number of these cards here, you can run through some player's development deck, you can get through all these fame cards and the King of King cards gets flipped over, etc., etc. There's multiple different end game conditions. A couple of them depend on which factions or nations are actually involved in the game. And then you're just going to go through your big stacks of cards and the different aspects of your deck and wherever they all are and count up all the points and see who has the most points and that player wins. So now let's get into the actual review, and I'm going to break this down into a few sections. So we're going to break this down, starting with I like to start off with sort of a context and potential biases section. This is just where I give you some context as to my sort of involvement with this and what I sort of came into this with. So I like a decent amount of deck builders. I think when I first got into the hobby, they really stood out to me, and I was loving deck builders and card games in general. In the past few years, I've cooled a bit in general over on deck building games, and they haven't appealed to me as much, but the fact that this was a deck building civilization game and that you had, your own faction deck, and I saw the beautiful artwork from the Miko and all this stuff, so it kind of drew me in. I came in with, knowing that I had heard a lot of things about it not being great with more than 2 players, that it was primarily a solo or 2-player game, and I knew that I was probably going to be playing this. I bought it to play solo primarily. I didn't think I was going to be playing it much as a 2-player game, but I did expect to enjoy it quite a bit, and that's sort of what I came at it from. No inherent biases in terms of designers, companies, past experience with games, that kind of thing. Now let's talk first impressions. So after my first game or two, actually let's rewind before the game or two, because it took a while to even get into that first game and actually playing it. So each of these games they're pretty much identical rule books. They each come with a standard rule book and the solo rule book. And there's also an appendix section at the back. And you can read more about this online. There's threads on Board Game Geek about this as well. But and some people would agree or disagree, but I personally had a lot of trouble with the rules. Just the way they were laid out, it felt like even though I read the rules and felt like I kind of understood them, I didn't know exactly what was the goal. What was I trying to do? Or maybe this one situation isn't explained, or it's in a different spot in the rule book. So, maybe you had to jump around a lot while playing the game or whatnot. So my first impression was that I kept feeling like I was discouraged because it was feeling hard to get that first game actually played. I kept thinking, I can start playing, but I don't understand quite how that works. Or, so I kept going online and looking at FAQs and all this stuff. And I ended up watching a couple playthroughs. So it took a while to get into it. And after the first game, I think I was extra conflicted because it felt like a lot. In a way, I felt like, okay, finally, I got that first game under my belt. Now I understand the rules. Now I finally got through this. Okay. And I thought, that was awesome. Like, I've never seen, the thing I mentioned before in the overview section about the history cards. Just the way that you have the game arc is kind of built into the game. And I'm going to talk about this stuff in more detail later. But I had all these things I really liked, but I remember telling myself, this could end up being like a 9 out of 10 game for me, like amazing game I'll play all the time. Or I could see it being like a maybe 6 out of 10, like it's kind of hampered by like certain things are holding it back. And I kept thinking, okay, I'm going to play it a bunch more and see how much quicker can I get at this system, because there's a lot of stuff to manage in this game, especially if you're playing it solo. So yeah, that was kind of my first impressions. So now I want to talk about the player count and the playtime. Again, I've only played it solo. This is the type of game where even like my very first play probably took about, including setup, teardown, checking up on rules throughout and whatever, for sure over 2 hours to play solo. Probably around 2.5 hours. Definitely less than 3. I haven't had a game go anywhere near 3 hours, but definitely 2 to 2.5 I'd say is the most common. I've played this, I believe, 6 times, and I think once or twice I got it in under 2 hours, but it felt like it was an early game end condition, or maybe I was specifically trying to play it quickly to see if I could get it under 2 hours. So playing it at a comfortable pace, even after my 5th, 6th game, it was still taking for sure over an hour and a half. Hour 45 to 2 hours is kind of the average, I'd say. So it's pretty long. When you play the game solo, to operate the opponent's bot, like you basically have these 5 cards in front, and you're going to roll a die, and the die is going to go on one of the cards. That card is not going to take effect, and then you're going to resolve these cards in order left to right, flipping them over. But when you flip a card, you're going to look at a chart. So in the back of the rulebook, there's a chart for every faction that you're playing against solo, and it'll tell you if these symbols are on the card, then you do this, and it'll give a little sentence or two, a little paragraph of what to do. So it's sort of self-automated, but you have to, every new, faction, these cards might work differently, and you have to flip a card and then, okay, what does this do again? And kind of read, oh, okay, yeah, it's going to do this. Okay, and then you kind of resolve it, and you're going through these cards. So depending how familiar you are with the game, how many times you've played it, how many times you've played against that nation, as with the AI solo opponent, you might start to get used to knowing what these cards do right away. Or you might remember, oh yeah, when I see a symbol, I already know, or they gain a location card, or you do these things. But the first game or two, there's a lot of stopping. What does this do again? Okay, I'm looking here. And then it's got one chart for if they're barbarian state, or one chart if they're empire state. So it's a lot to manage. But it's not an excessive amount to be able to actually get through the game necessarily. With 2 players, obviously you're not in charge of operating a bot, but the game has fairly low player interaction. It's very heads down. There are certain things, obviously, the more you learn the game and you're playing against different people, I don't want to downplay experienced players playing against each other. You will want to keep track of what your opponent's doing. If you just look down in front of you, you're not going to be very good at the game necessarily. But still, in terms of the actual interactions that happen throughout the game, other than kind of keeping an eye and adjusting your strategy based on your opponent, there isn't a ton of interaction throughout the game. So adding a second player, and this is part of the reason why I never added, a second, or tried a 2, 3, 4 players. I thought I was going to play it as a 2-player game, but the more I played it solo, the more I realized I don't want the added downtime. I know how long, on average, sort of my turns were taking, and even facilitating the bots' turns and all that. I thought, I don't want any more time. I'd rather be almost facilitating the bots' turns than just waiting for my opponent to make decisions, because I know there's a lot on the line in this game, and a lot of this is efficiency, and it's a longer game, so your turns sometimes can fly by, but other times you're drawing cards, and then you're doing multiple effects. So sometimes the turns can go on a little longer. So I think there are people online who I've seen say that they've gotten it to, an hour and a half solo. Props to you. I mean, maybe I would have been able to get it to that after playing another 10, 15 times, or just really forcing myself to rush a bit more. But so that covers, I think, all of it in terms of player count and time that I want to talk about. Now I want to talk about what sets it apart. There's a lot. I touched on a lot of it in the overview section. the fact that you have a nation card that has this built-in arc is one of the most interesting things. The fact that you have this starting deck that is, everyone has a different starting. This isn't like Dominion or whatever. You get your however many gold cards and your not provinces, whatever those cheap ones are called, estates, or even Quest for El Dorado, which is one of my favorite deck builders, or maybe my favorite deck builder. You get pretty basic cards at the start. In this game, there's certain cards that you'll see in certain decks that they're like, oh, I remember this other faction also had the starting card, but you're also getting a bunch of unique cards right off the bat. So that right away, the beginning of the game is much more interesting than most deck builders I've played, because you're playing interesting, unique, faction-specific cards right off the start of the game, and you're getting through your deck quickly and adding new cards, and you're not only buying cards from the market, but you're getting your own nation cards in. So you have this dual influence of which direction are you going with your own faction based on what tools are available to you, because even each faction you can play in numerous different ways. Depending on some factions, you can play more different ways than others. Some might only have 2 or 3 play styles or whatever. But you also have the common cards that could also, you could go the same direction with your nation cards, but then you buy different common cards from here, and that changes up the dynamic of how you're building your deck too. And the fact that certain empires are going to become, or certain factions will become empires faster or slower than others. There's some actually that are just always barbarian state the entire game. I think it's the Vikings. There's another faction I think is always the Empire state. There's little ways that they kind of subvert these kind of expectations and these things to kind of offer something unique, and I really appreciate that. So that's something I wanted to point out. Also, again, that history aspect, the fact that the cards go out of your history and sort of just stay into a pile where you can get the rewards from that at the end of the game. Awesome. I love that. Even the Unrest cards is cool, because the Unrest is a general supply. Like when this general supply of Unrest cards runs out, if you're playing with 2 players or more, this is going to trigger the end of the game, and then you're going to see who has the most points and wins. But in a solo game, if the Unrest pile runs out, the human player just loses automatically. So this is an extra condition. You have to be making sure if this Unrest pile is depleting, maybe your opponent is taking Unrest cards or doing something that's making them go. So now you have to change your strategy to be focusing on getting rid of Unrest cards out of your deck, because you think, well, I think they have more points than me, so I don't want this game to end soon, and the only way I can extend it is if but I want to play this card, but they'll probably end the game on their turn. Okay, so I guess I'll spend my turn getting rid of these Unrest cards. So it's important to make sure you're not keeping too many in your deck, not only for them clogging it with bad abilities, but also like -2 points. If you have a lot of those, like those add up. There's lots of cool stuff in this game. There's the victory point, the Fame deck, which is these really high value cards that both players are kind of getting cards from throughout the game at times. There's all kinds of stuff here. I won't get too much more in depth into what sets it apart, but even just like all the unique art with the factions. There's so many factions. The mixing and matching with the boxes. I just think there's a lot of cool stuff that it does in here. So what do I like most about the game? Is a lot of those things that set it apart, basically. The history aspect, the artwork, even though some of these, there's a varying level of kind of thematic presence from the nations and some of these cards. Some of these cards, you read the ability and you look at the card and the art and the name and you think, oh, that makes sense thematically for what that card is doing, like this leadership card or this, mountain or whatever. Sometimes what it is actually corresponds to the card. Other times it doesn't, and it feels a bit arbitrary, and that's fine. But overall, each faction, whether it's the artwork, the names, the abilities, the things that are part of their history, I love that, because I'm not like a history buff in any way. I'm the type of person, like it interests me, but I haven't soaked in a lot of this. Like a lot of these nation decks, I opened up and would be like, I would be flipping through cards and saying, I didn't know about that part, and maybe I'd go look something up. So it's kind of piqued my curiosity a lot about this too, and it was easy to kind of fall in love with just kind of like looking through the cards even before or after the game and just soaking in like, what was part of the Macedonians' history that I might not be aware of, or what other tools or whatever did like the Vikings have that might be in their cards. So sometimes the card is like a person that was part of this nation's history, like an actual figure. Like I think one of the Greeks have, or the Romans have Caesar, for example. Or you'll have events that happened, or you'll have items, or like someone has like one of the factions has like ships that they have. So there's all kinds of cool things that set them apart. And there is really a lot to like here. The fact that there are so many different factions and different types of cards is really interesting. Again, even just the different developments, like the development cards are really interesting because they really give you unique stuff. Like some of the cards you get from here, some of the more basic cards in your deck are going to be, whether I'm spending a progress token to get this or I'm spending a population to get this, like some of those abilities, even though they have different symbols or different resources, feel interchangeable, but there are still enough abilities in here that feel different enough and unique enough, and each faction has its own identity, which I do really appreciate. There are just a lot of things that tend to sort of get in the way of my enjoyment of the game, and it feels like every time I'm discovering something new, I'm getting over the hump and starting to really get into enjoying the nitty-gritty of the game, there's something else. It just feels like there's always some type of barrier. So first off, there's the setup and teardown. So not only are you, again, whether you're playing solo or with another player, you're taking out your faction deck, then to create the market, you're taking out certain cards to lay out here, then you're, depending on player count, you're putting a certain number of cards, then you're creating a new deck that is with some of these leftover cards. Each player has to set up their own faction deck. There's, 3, 4, or 5, depending on the faction, different types of cards. So you're setting one set of cards here. Some of them are face up, some are face down. Some of them you're shuffling beforehand. Some of them, you have one single card face up with some other ones face down on top. So these are just little things that, until you've played the game a lot, these aren't going to be second nature quick things. So the first 2, 3 times, 4 times you play, you're probably going to be having to read every step of the setup, or, and it's going to be a bit of a time-consuming process. And then what about when you're done the game? Well, you've added all the kinds of cards from here into your deck. You've put cards from your development deck in your main deck. You've put stuff into your history, whatever. You have stuff on the board. So you're having to take apart your entire deck, and you have cards that you want to group together to put back in your own deck slot in the box, and then you have to remove ones that go back into the common deck, and even the common deck cards each gets into their own categories that then go into the box in that way. So even just setup and tear down is like this whole thing. Again, I don't want to overemphasize this too much, because when you get used to it, it's not like this problem never gets better. It does get better, but there is a kind of a learning curve, or a kind of sort of internalization time period, I guess, where you have to get through this a certain amount of times before you start to kind of get familiar with it. And what else is there? I mean, there's all kinds of, again, if you're playing solo, which is the only way I played it, you're constantly managing the bot, and you're having to, okay, you flip this card and look in the rules, and what does this thing do? Okay, it does this thing here. Okay, reading. Okay, yeah, that's good. And then it does this. Okay, you're reading through. You're shuffling not only your own deck multiple times throughout the game, but then you're also shuffling your the solo AI bot deck. When that runs out, you're having to shuffle that up too. And the AI deck also gets set up in a different way. It has its own setup instructions, because that deck works differently than your own. And even 2 of the cards that you thought would be the same, one of their cards doesn't even matter when you play against the solo. So there's these other little, just kind of like little things to remember. What else do we have here? I mean, in terms of the quality of the cards is very poor. I'm just going to say it's not the worst I've seen or anything like that, but for a game that it's a deck building game. It's primarily cards. You shuffle, you handle cards, you're mixing and matching cards in and out of decks, you're shuffling over and over and over. Like, the game feels like it's made for people who want to play this game over and over and over, and to me, it just feels like a travesty that the cards are this low quality. Like, it's not that I expect the game to have included sleeves, but then up the quality of the cards, because I've played this like 6 times, and I can already see the wear on lots of cards, corners being kind of frayed or bent, or little, white edges starting to show. The cards bend pretty easily. I'm really surprised in a disappointing way. I'm disappointed that for a game like this, that if I did decide that I want to keep this and play it for a long time, I'm basically either forced to sleeve the game, in which case there's only, the insert is very tight, the slots are very tight. I think there's very thin sleeves you could get. I've seen threads online where people say most sleeves don't even fit in the insert, so you have to throw the insert out, or buy thinner sleeves, and that's going to be a lot of sleeves. Or if you're just not going to buy sleeves, you just have to accept that your cards are just going to wear down pretty quickly, and the quality is really going to start to show. And in a game where, especially like fame cards, where these important high scoring cards, and you're drawing blind off the top of a deck, like, it's important to have cards that aren't damaged, so you don't start to know what card that is in the middle of a game. Like, this is a long game, the stakes are high, cards can be very, very powerful and that sort of thing. So to me, that just seems like an oversight, and I realize it's probably a cost issue. And some of this is going to come back when I talk about something else a little bit later in the video. Yeah, I mean, it feels like there's an obstacle every time, and then a couple other things. So there's also rules that are either unclear or just straight up missing or wrong in one of the 2 rule books. So I've had to go online and find actually that this has been corrected and clarified here, that this isn't the case. Maybe I already played the game twice with the wrong rules. Now I have to unlearn this thing. Okay, then there's another FAQ with this other rule that's been added, or I found that there was, as I mentioned in the overview section, there's errata. So now a bunch of the cards have been changed. Not only have there been rule tweaks, but some of the cards have been changed. And if you didn't find this thread on Board Game Geek, there would be no way for you to know, just opening up this box, reading the rules, playing the game, that some of these cards have been changed. And now I realized, okay, well, so now I have to either print out a copy of this FAQ with these errata changes with me, or then wait until Horizons comes out next year to get all the new cards to put into the game. It just feels like every time there's some type of obstacle. And if I want to try, maybe I want to get rid of the solo aspect of managing the bot. Okay, well, I'll play with 2 players. But that game's probably going to take, like, for sure, minimum 2 hours, probably 2.5-ish, especially with someone new. And it just feels like that's another barrier that, like, do I want to go teach this game to someone? They're not going to really get the full experience and enjoyment out of it in the first game. So they're probably going to want to play it a second or third time. It's going to be a lot of heads down, not a lot of interaction. So it's such a conflicting game for me. And I know I feel like I've spent a lot of time on the negative parts here, but I mean, they do stand out, and it would be wrong of me to talk about this game without highlighting these things. And there's actually one more that I do want to highlight, which is the scoring at the end, because it's another aspect of the game that's kind of a bit of a pain, but it is also just unsatisfying in terms of determining the end result in the game. Whether you have a feeling that you were going to win or not, or you don't know if the game's up in the air, regardless of how you feel about your standing, to get to the end of the game and then go through that process of, like, you've got different piles of cards and you're starting to look through them for points. And again, sometimes just point value, like 2 points, 4 points. Some of them say 1 per one of these cards you have, or, you know, for if you have this other card, or if this card's in your history, it's 5 points, but if it's just in your regular deck, it's worth 2 points. So you also can't take the cards out and put them in one pile, because when you look through them, they refer to, if this, you know, you get 1 point for every pinned card that was on your board. Okay, well then I got to count all my other cards while leaving the pinned ones. So, but then how do you remember which ones you did or didn't count? There's apparently a scoring app that's been invented, but, like, then you're taking a picture of all the stuff, and how do I know that the app's 100% accurate? Like, it just feels like every time I was willing to overlook one thing, there was something else that said, well, what about this other thing that this other obstacle, this other hurdle to kind of work around? Okay, so to end off, I basically just want to give you a couple of comparisons to other games, either that I've played or ones that you might be familiar with, as well as talk about maybe some of the other deck building games I've played or haven't played, to kind of give you an idea of where this stands for me, and then I'll kind of give you my bottom line and final thoughts at the end. So some of the comparables I would say would be games like Aeon's End, Marvel Champions, or you can also throw Arkham Horror in there, which I haven't played Arkham Horror, or like Gloomhaven or Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion. And the reason I bring those up is they don't necessarily all play accurately, like, you know, they're not necessarily all deck builders or whatnot, but they're all games that can be played solo or at higher player counts. They're all games that rely heavily on cards and that have a lot of fiddliness, a lot of setup, teardown, managing, you know, AI, depending on what player count you're playing at. So that's kind of the space that this falls into for me. And just for some context, Aeon's End was one of the first deck builders I played. I played it for years, loved the game, ended up moving on from it, didn't last ultimately for similar reasons as this. Aeon's End had, you know, you can lose a few turns in, and it's a lot of setup and teardown time, and I thought the game also was best solo or with 2 players, so a lot of similar things. But Aeon's End, the overhead of getting into the game and the rules clarity, like, there weren't anywhere near as many barriers, and yet that game still ended up leaving my collection. Now, the highs in Imperium Classics, the things I like best about Imperium Classics, I probably like those equally or maybe even more than some of the things in Aeon's End, but the obstacles, the hurdles in this game are much higher than Aeon's End. Marvel Champions isn't one that I've played a whole lot, so I won't comment on that one, but if you've played it, you can at least put that into context a bit. And Marvel Champions is fairly similar to Aeon's End as well. So the other one I want to quickly focus on is Gloomhaven, specifically Jaws of the Lion, because I played through the original Gloomhaven campaign with a group of 4, and Dylan, who I co-run the channel with here, it was his game. He knew the rules better than anyone. He was sort of managing all the stuff until we started using the Gloomhaven app, helper app and stuff. I got Jaws of the Lion, played through it solo, two-handed, and just to give you some perspective, that game is playing two-handed as you're looking at one set of cards, you might decide what you want to do, then you might look at the other character's cards and decide what you want to do, and then after looking at those, you might say, oh, well then hang on a second, then I'm going to do something else actually with this. You might be going back and forth, you know, you're managing 2 different characters of your own, then you're managing your enemies. There's your own modifier deck that adds or subtracts from your attacks. You've got the enemies deck that adds or subtracts from attacks. You've got things between scenarios. You know, when you level up, you got to do things to your deck, like buying and selling items. There's all kinds of stuff in Jaws of the Lion. I played through it in about 3 weeks solo. I had a great time, and even though the fiddliness and that stuff was like, that was kind of on the cusp, that was the verge of what I deemed acceptable for something that I would want to play, and that it wouldn't hamper my enjoyment too much. Again, Imperium Classics once more and Legends has more of that than I'd like, and because of the fact that it's, again, a fairly low interaction, fairly heads down game, and because of how long it takes, it's just hard for me to get past all those little negative hurdles. So it kind of, I stand in a weird spot because I have to commend the designers and the development team on this game, because this is one of the most ambitious games I've played in a long time, and I don't think there's many people out there who could have done a better job. Like, I really do think that it's just, they took on almost an impossible task, and Nigel Buckle in particular, who I think is the one who had the idea for the game, and then David Trixie came on board later, poured like years of his life into this, and you can see it in the way that these civilization decks and nation decks are all built with this care, and like all the unique art from the Miko on these cards across both games. Like it's a stunning product, and the amount of care and just love that has gone into this game should not be overlooked. But I just wish this was a digital game. If there was an app, if they make an app for this one day, or a version on Steam that I can buy digitally, I will buy that in a heartbeat, and I will play it to death. Because if someone else is handling all that stuff for me, if the decks are being shuffled, if I can just, open the program, pick this deck, pick this opponent, the game is set up and ready to go, and afterwards the cards go back into the box in their slots, I hit, new setup, whatever, and I can play games in maybe half the time, this would be an incredible game. I would play this all the time, and I would recommend it to almost anyone out there who likes deck building games, civilization games, solo. Like, I would recommend this highly to almost everyone. But as it stands with the physical version, I can only really recommend this if you either have a small collection and you don't play a lot of different games, or you want something that you just really, really want to sink your teeth into and dive into one game or game system for, weeks, months, potentially years. Once Horizons comes out, there's going to be I think thousands of possible combinations with all the faction decks. There's different difficulty levels that you can play with the bots. You can do a mini campaign as well. Like, there's all kinds of, if you like the game and if you have the patience and the time for that system, there are very few games that have this much content and this much kind of rewarding stuff in the box for you to dig into and explore. But if you're like me, someone who's playing a lot of games these days, or maybe doesn't love this enough to make it my main game or one of my main games for a while, it's a tough sell to just pick it up and try it, or have it as a casual game that sits on your shelf for a while. So yeah, it's Imperium Classics. I kept playing it and wanting to like it more and give it more chances and think maybe after a few more plays it'll be smoother, but I just kept not wanting to play it as much anymore because of all those little barriers getting in the way. So ultimately, it's a game that I enjoy and really respect and really admire a lot of what's going on. But I guess I eagerly await the digital version, because until it comes out digitally, I probably won't be playing this again. But that's all I've got for Imperium Classics and Legends. Thank you so much for watching the review. I'm curious if you have played this, what do you think? Are there things that I might have overlooked that maybe you found really helped with moving the game along quickly? Or did you find it did have all these obstacles and maybe that turned you off from the game a bit as well? Or maybe you didn't care and you liked the game so much that the obstacles weren't a big deal for you? Either way, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.